Endless 8. The thing that is perhaps the biggest waste of money in anime history, or yet another subversion for intellectuals like myself to obsess over. I'm gonna warn you up front, this is less of a review of Endless 8 and more of a rant, just to get a bunch of things out on my thoughts on the whole thing, just so that you know. It's gonna be less of an actual review and more of a me talking to the camera thing. If you don't like that, feel free to move on and enjoy the rest of your day. Otherwise, I'm gonna be talking about Endless 8. Let's go. Okay, so for those of you who are not in the know, Endless 8 is a storyline in Haruhi's second season, or about halfway if you're watching the show chronologically, that takes place in the last 2 weeks of their summer. Why it is of importance is because it might as well be truly endless. The story is like a stereotypical science fiction plot, wherein the main characters are trapped in an endless Groundhog Day time loop. Very similar to the entire plot of Higurashi. The only difference is that none of the characters really realize that it's happening, especially Kyon, who constantly wakes up at the beginning of every new 2 weeks with no knowledge that everything is repeating at all, and this is very noticeable in his narration. It's only after Itsuki loses his powers and Mikuru loses connection with the future, and Yuki calmly explains that she's observed all 100,000 loops so far, that things really start to sink in. Yuki is the only character that actually realizes that everything's going on at all times because she has some telepathic link to the alien hive mind, and that's fun, but because Yuki is the observer and not really allowed to do anything, it doesn't really matter. And the time loop continues on for the entire course of the 2 weeks. Then we get to do it all over again next week. And that is how this arc is played out, and that is why it has slightly pissed some people off. Because unlike shows like Higurashi, that does indeed have a time loop, but displays it in that there are massive changes to the time loop every time. It just happens to end up resulting in the same kind of ending by the end of it. Unlike that, in Endless 8, nothing really changes. There are minor, tiny changes, but 80% of every episode is almost identical to the episode that was before it. Like, even Kyon's narration is more or less the same from episode to episode. But of course, they are not entirely exact. The animation, for example, is not like copy-pasta from every episode. The scenes and what happens to the characters and what the characters may do or say are exactly the same, but the angles and the animation is all new. Like, all the animation is done in different angles, in slightly different orders, but it's ultimately the same scenes every episode, which, from an entertainment standpoint, is kind of boring. And this is why it has sparked so much controversy, because if you're like me who watched Endless 8 when it was airing, that's 8 weeks, because it is Endless 8. 8 episodes. 8 weeks of more or less the same episode every week. And it was the most boring thing you could imagine. Yeah, the minor changes were there, but they were not enough to change it from an entertainment standpoint. Hell, during Otakon in 2009, Yukata Yamamoto, who was the series production director for season 1 of Haruhi but left Kyoto Annie before season 2 began, was asked what he thought of the Endless 8 arc, and he stated that when the idea was originally floating around, he was still there, and that he was against it and it should have been 2 episodes tops, not 8. And well, that probably should have been more fair, because like the original Endless 8 portion of the Haruhi light novels was only 30 pages. So to take 30 pages and turn it into 8 episodes, most of which is the exact same thing, is a bit extreme. And it's not just from an entertainment standpoint that you gotta look at this. I'm sure from a production standpoint, it was not very easy on Kyoto Annie's wallet either, because anime is not cheap. It really isn't. So to produce 8 episodes, and because, as I said before, all the animation is different every episode, it might as well have been different episodes from a production standpoint. And that costs a lot of money. But as weird as it is, I do see some of Endless 8's merits. But it doesn't have any merits, you might say. It's a complete waste of your time, you might cry. Not necessarily. Watching the same episode 8 times is painful. Yes, but it's not as bad as watching it 15,832 times, which is, I believe, exactly how many loops there are. And you can also be thankful that each individual episode was not 2 weeks long, which is the exact length of a loop. It's only 20 minutes. And you should be thankful for all of that, because if it was not that way, you would have just experienced everything Yuki Nagato just experienced. All 15,000 some odd loops, 2 weeks at a time. I like Endless 8 because it doesn't pull some bullcrap like Doctor Who, where they have a character who is left behind for a few thousand years, and then they act like it never happened from that point on. Because really, these situations should have massive effects on the characters, because they just spent probably the majority of their existence now either waiting or in this time loop, constantly repeating over and over again, or just sitting there doing nothing. It's a massive thing, but then it is acted normally in other situations like nothing has ever happened. Now granted, with Yuki, she is kind of the emotionless doll character, and there is nothing very obvious on the outside that this has affected her at all, but it really has. Endless 8 had an enormous effect on Yuki's character, and it is very important to keep in mind when you move into watching the Disappearance movie. Also, one could also look at Endless 8 and say that it's just one big giant subversion of basically everything Kyoto Annie had done up until that point. Like, look at the key adaptations that they did. Air, Canon 06, and Clan Ad. Between the three of them, they are, at their core, exactly the same. Sure, the situations are different and there's little differences in the character, but ultimately, the stories are really similar. So you could argue that Endless 8 is sort of a riff on that. But ultimately, the question becomes, Arkada, do you feel that watching Endless 8 is worth it? Do you feel that we should submit ourselves to this thing, these 8 episodes of potential boredom? Yes. At least once. If you never want to slog through it again, and after you've gone through it the one time, you feel that you don't need to see all of it all over again, I perfectly understand that. In fact, I might do the same, and on other rewatchings, I might not watch all of them, but just watch like 1, 4, 5, and 8, I think, because 4 and 5 contain more or less the exact same things that 2 and 3 did, while having the minor changes, and then 8 is, of course, the end of the whole thing. But yes, I do say that you should watch the whole thing for a number of reasons. Firstly, because then you'll know what all the hubbub is about. When people talk to you about Endless 8, you'll understand what it is they're talking about, and you'll be able to feel their pain. Secondly, watching all of Endless 8 will allow you to develop your own opinion on the whole matter, which is kind of important. And thirdly, experiencing all of Endless 8 will really help you understand some character motivations that exist within the Disappearance movie. And that, I think, is the most important thing about it. Yeah, one might think that Kyoto Annie was just trolling their entire fan base with the thing, but if so, it was one of the most expensive trollings I've ever seen. But what do you think? Was Endless 8 a monumentous waste of time? But what do you think? Was Endless 8 just a monumentous waste of time, energy, resources, and the patience of the Haruhi fans? Or was it a necessary way to drive home some aspects of the show that otherwise would have gone unnoticed? Let me know down in the comments, but please avoid spoilers for the light novels, because there are some people that have not really looked into the story of Haruhi beyond the Disappearance movie. And I'd like to keep it that way. And until next time, ladies, gentlemen, and others, stay frosty.